I'm Zahira. I will be your panelist for this panel. Um, Now, I have a question for the audience. Who here is aware of what this game is? Anyone? Okay, I'll take that as a no. All right. So, um, the FF14 TTRPG is something that is brand new. The starter set only came out a month or two ago. I believe it came out either early September or late August, something around there. And we are getting or no, sorry, the pre-orders opened up in like May, but people only got them recently. Regardless, the full rulebook isn't going to come out until February. So as a disclaimer, a lot of stuff in this presentation may be subject to change, just because the full game isn't out yet. Um, but we will go from here. So let's start with what is the Final Fantasy XIV tabletop RPG? So it is a translation of the combat systems of Final Fantasy XIV to the tabletop. So you have levels, you have your GCDs, you have your OGCDs, you have your AoE markers, boss phases, objectives, even stealth mini games. There was a stealth mini game in the in the starter set encounters, which was funny, and obviously limit breaks. The system is built off of a D20 system. So if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, it feels very similar to that. A lot of the time, in order to resolve things and determine whether or not you succeed or fail, you're going to be rolling a D20, which is a 20-sided die. However, the system only uses 6-sided dice, or D6s, to determine damage amounts. The abilities that you have are based on your job and are set. There is unfortunately no customization, which, depending on your preferences, is either a good thing or a bad thing. The combat operates on a square grid, and distance is measured in squares, whereas other systems will use things like feet or meters. The other interesting thing about the system that I want to get out of the way is that there is no rules as written. There is no level progression. You do not gain levels as you complete combat encounters. Instead, your level is changed based on the encounter that you're in, similar to like level sync within the game. When you go and do a low level fate, you have to sync your level down. However, by completing encounters, you gain titles, which are passive bonuses that give your character a little bit of a boost. So, how do you play? Well, we will start off with the primary and secondary attributes. Your character is comprised mainly of these. These are your strength, dexterity, vitality, intelligence, and mind. Each of them does different things and is helpful for different reasons, and is used by different jobs, some jobs more than others. So, for example, warriors and like a dragoon might use strength, whereas like a black mage might use intelligence, or a white mage might use mind as their main stat. Then your secondary attributes are derived from your primary attributes, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But uh, they're effectively your armor class, if you know what that is from D&D. Well, your defense and magical defense, anyway. Defense helps to protect you from physical attacks, whereas magical defense protects you from magical attacks. Vigilance is equivalent to a passive perception. If you know D&D, it's basically a stat that tells you how good your character is at perceiving their surroundings. How and how hard it is for enemies to sneak up on you, kind of idea. Uh, and then your movement, which tells you how fast you can move. In addition to this, you also have your HP and MP, obviously. MP is capped at 5 in this, and you gain 2 MP at the end of each round as natural regen. So things don't quite translate one-to-one between the game and the TTRPG because 5 is a lot smaller than 10,000. And then you also have your HP, which is determined based off of your vitality, which, again, we'll get into that later, but it determines how much damage you can take before you're knocked out. All right, combat encounters typically happen on a 10 by 10 grid. This is an example of what a combat encounter setup would look like from the fate that was posted on the website. Typically, there's an objective, which is, either defeat all the enemies, escort cargo, could be all sorts of things. And then combat encounters are divided into phases, which are further divided into rounds, and then each round is divided into turns. So during each phase, there's multiple rounds, and after a certain condition is triggered, you move on to the next phase of the encounter. Typically, phases change when more enemies are added to the encounter, or a boss hits a certain HP threshold, or something similar. And then within each round, each player and each enemy is going to get to take a turn. The turn order in this game is a little bit different than what other games might do. As an example, in D&D, everybody rolls initiative, and then you assign yourselves in a turn order based on that initiative number. In this, all of the players, all the adventurers, will act before the enemies. During your first round, you pick amongst yourselves what order you will perform your actions in, and then that turn order is set for the rest of the encounter. Then, once all of the players have gone, first they recover 2 MP, but then we go to the enemy step in which all of the enemies will act in order. Then we go to the end of the round, and then the round will repeat. Before I go any further, oops, hold on. How do I go back? Oh, that's bad. That's not what I meant to do. 1 second. Okay, does anyone have any questions so far? Just wanted to check in because I'm going through a lot of information very quickly. I'll take that as a no. All right. So during your turn, you get 3 things. You get a primary ability, a secondary ability, and a movement. So movement is you can move up to the amount of spaces that's listed. You can also break up your movement as much as you'd like. So you can move 2 squares, do your primary ability, move 1 square, do your secondary ability, move another 2 squares. Doesn't matter. Or you can forego your movement entirely to take what's called a focus, which allows you to take a secondary action that turn. Your primary ability usually consists of things from the game that are your GCDs. So think Stone, True Thrust, Holy, Fell Cleave. These things will typically require a roll for a direct hit or crit. You can also, instead of performing a primary ability, you can use everybody has access to sprint, which will consume your primary ability, but will double your movement for that turn. Then we have secondary abilities. These are typically your OGCDs, with some caveats that I'll get into. Um, these are typically things that will buff or debuff you. You can use a secondary ability with your primary action if you'd like to. So theoretically, you could take 3 secondary abilities in the same turn if you use your primary to do a secondary ability, use your secondary to do a secondary ability, and then focus for another secondary ability. Secondary actions is also how you consume consumables. So if you have a potion or an ether, you use those with a secondary action. And then finally, we have instants. Instants are a little interesting because the way that they function is you get 1 instant per turn. So um, not just on your turn, but on enemy turns, ally turns, anybody's turn. As long as the trigger condition on the instant is met, so as an example with this swift cast, it says when any character finishes their turn. As long as the trigger condition is met for an instant ability, you can use it. As long as you haven't already used an instant on that turn. These are usually things that are utility or are useful to have as a reaction to something. So this is things like mitigation, knockback resist, interrupts, and any damage abilities that are like spammable. If you think like Machinist's Gauss Round or Bard's Bloodletter, because they have a whole bunch of charges, and so using them all within a reasonable amount of time would be really hard to do unless they were instants. Abilities are usually you have a whole bunch of information. You have the name and the types of the ability. So as you can see, it'll say primary physical ranged volley, primary magic ice aspected invoked. These are all just tags on the ability that will give you that other abilities will mention if it's important. Um, then some abilities have requirements such as straight shot on Bard. Some abilities have mana costs such as Blizzard, and then all abilities have a target, a range. All primary abilities will have a check, but I don't believe any secondary or instants do. Um, the check is just what you have to roll in order to hit, or I'll get to that in a second, but it's, yeah. And then the CR is the challenge rating. It is what you are rolling against. So uh, when you roll, you compare it to the CR. Then we have the base effect, which is the base effect is what you get regardless of what you roll. This is what separates this game from something like D&D, where if you miss an attack, you get no benefits. You always get the base effect of any ability that you use. And I'll get into how direct hit works in a moment, because I have another slide for that, but we'll get there. Combo lets you know that you can use another ability immediately after this one. So as an example, this warrior combo, heavy swing plus maim, will combo into Storm's Path. So if you think of the 1-2-3 combo on warrior, that's essentially what that is. And then some abilities have limitations. Like if I go back, the swift cast here has a little box at the top and says at the bottom once per phase. That's a limitation on how many times you can use it. But yeah, as you can see here, primary abilities. You roll the check, you compare against the challenge rating. If you get higher or equal to the challenge rating that you were trying to reach, then you get the direct hit bonus in addition to your base effect. If you roll a 20, then you crit, which means that you get to double all of the dice that you roll for damage on top of getting the base effect and direct hit. So in this case, if I were to crit on the True Thrust, I would be rolling 4d6 plus 3 instead of 2d6 plus 3. And then because, Truth Thrust has combo, I can combo into either Dragoon combo or Disembowel. Does that... How high of a roll constitutes a direct hit trigger? Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's based on the enemy defense. Yeah. All right. Okay. And then we have secondary abilities. So these are typically things that are OGCDs, but some of them are not. You might notice that Arrow is sitting over here in the secondary ability section, despite the fact that it is on your global cooldown in the game. But these are abilities that are typically less strong than a primary ability, but are more utility focused. And they don't require a roll. You just use it. And then we have instant. Oh, and then items are typically secondary actions. So we have the ether here as an example. And then instant abilities. So these are things you can use on other people's turns. You can only use one per turn. You pick the ability, you do the effect. Some of them do have checks, as you can see with Footgraze, but typically that's not the case. And then you mark it off if it has a limit involved. And then finally we have limit breaks. The way limit breaks work in this is a little odd because there's no limit break gauge. Instead, whenever you enter a phase where the GM decides that you have limit breaks, you have limit breaks. Between the entire party, you only get 3 limit breaks total, and each player can only use 1 limit break in the phase that you get them. But the other thing that's interesting about the limit breaks in this game is that unlike in the video game, they are unique to each job rather than the role. There are some similarities between limit breaks in the same role, but you'll see when we go into the tanks later, because we have data for 3 of them, that they all have completely different limit breaks. It's very interesting. Okay. And then this is just a sort of refresher on what I explained already in terms of how combat rules work. I will note though that some checks will say special, which means that you can only crit. You're not looking for a direct hit. There is no CR to roll against. You're just seeing if you roll a 20 in order to crit. That's typically on things like healing abilities, like Cure 2 or Adloquium. Yeah. And then we also have advantage and penalties. So some effects will apply advantage, which works just like it does in D&D. You roll an extra d20, and then you pick the higher of the two. However, in this system, advantage stacks. So if you get advantage from multiple sources, then you can be rolling 4 or 5 d20s and then picking the highest one, which can make it very strong because it means that it's much easier to direct hit and much easier to crit. However, penalties are applied after the roll. So if you have an attack that you're making that has, I don't know, you say you have like 3 advantage, right? So you're rolling 4 d20s, and then you pick the highest one, and let's say it's like a 15, and then you have a -5 penalty that drops it to 10. Well, you might still not have enough in order to actually direct hit the target. It's not like D&D where advantage and disadvantage will cancel out. You can have both on the roll, and so the math can get a little tricky, but typically it's not too bad. Okay. Now, when your HP reaches 0, obviously, I think you all know what happens in the game. You get knocked out, and somebody has to raise you. In the context of the TTRPG, when you get knocked out, and you get brought back, you're given the weakness debuff. The weakness applies a -2 to all of your attack rolls, so it makes it harder to direct hit, um, and it's not great, honestly. If you die again and you still have weakness and you get brought back, then you get Brink of Death, which gives you a -5 to all of your attack rolls, which means that more likely than not, you are going to be missing. Something that is interesting that the TTRPG has that the video game doesn't is you cannot keep raising people infinitely. If somebody has Brink of Death and they are brought back and they are raised again, they are given the comatose debuff, which means that they get instantly knocked out and cannot be raised. The comatose debuff also has some implications outside of combat in that if you are comatose, then you have to take a rest in order to actually recover from it. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about rests because there weren't a lot of good rules provided in the PDF that we have, so we're going to have to figure that out when the full book comes out. Then we have enemies. Enemies kind of do their own thing. Their stats don't are kind of all over the place and don't follow the same rules as player stats. And they tend to have multiple abilities, and also they tend to have a list of tactics. So I don't know if it's hard to read, but there is a list of tactics here that explains what the enemy does on their turn in each round, and it also explains when you have enmity on something, how their tactics change. And I'll get to enmity in a second because it's very different from the game. And then, obviously, non-combat rolls are you just roll a d20 and you add your relevant attribute. There's no skills in this game. It's a little bare bones, honestly. Like, you roll a d20 and you add intelligence to find out, like, the history of a place, and that's about it. Or somebody is rolling a check against your vigilance if they're trying to, like, stealth past you or something. And this is where we go into the deep analysis. So, again, disclaimer. I'm going into specific abilities that exist in the TTRPG. Some of these abilities are heavily subject to change because they come from fan translations of sheets that were posted on the Japanese Twitter account. But we already know from Bard getting released that things can change between those sheets that were posted on the Japanese Twitter and the actual final product. Because we have the final product of Bard now and it is not the same. Okay, so first of all, I did a whole bunch of math with a spreadsheet, and I was able to reverse engineer the formulas for the primary and secondary attributes. So at level 30, oh, and I should mention, because I forgot to put this in earlier, in the TTRPG, your character is level 30, level 40, level 50, level 55, or level 60. The book that is coming out does not go above that, and there are no levels in between those level tiers. It's a choice. But at level 30, your character has 12 total attributes, and they have a maximum of a +5 in any given attribute. At level 50, you get +1 to all of your attributes, and then at level 60, you get +1 to your vitality and +1 to your main stat, which is based on the job. So like a dragoon would get +1 vitality, +1 strength. A ninja would get +1 vitality, +1 dex. You get the idea. As for your defense and magical defense, things get a little bit more complicated. So to calculate your defense, you have to take a base value, and then you take the average between your strength and your dex, rounded up, and you add it. The base value for non-tanks is 10 for defense, and for tanks it is 12. So tanks are slightly stronger against physical attacks by default. Magic defense is the same, except it's the average between intelligence and mind, and the tanks have a base of 11, whereas non-tanks have a base of 10. So magical defense is slightly harder to come by, unless you are specifically a magic, like a caster or a healer. Then we have the HP and MP formulas. So MP is just 5, no matter what. HP is a little weird because it is, you take a base value and you add your vitality multiplied by your level divided by 10. I imagine that it's rounded up for level 55, but we don't have any actual character sheets for level 55 yet, so the level 55 numbers are assumptions and not actual knowledge yet. Okay, and then a note on job conversion. So all of the jobs in the TTRPG have their kits taken from Endwalker. Additionally, some of the combos have been condensed. So typically you'll have a 1-2-3 combo. They will condense 2 of those buttons together, depending on where the where the point is where the combo branches into the 2 different combos that you typically have on a melee or tank. So on Dragoon, for example, you have True Thrust, and then it branches into Vorpal Thrust plus Full Thrust, or Disembowel plus Chaos Thrust. There's no cast times here, but interrupts still exist. What happens is all of the abilities that would have cast times have the invoked tag, and you can spend an instant to interrupt any ability that is invoked. And then, as I sort of mentioned earlier, GCDs typically become primary abilities, and OGCDs typically become secondary and instant abilities, but it's a little, it's it's job dependent, so it's a little odd. AoE attacks are all square. There are no cone AoE attacks that players have access to in the TTRPG. It's all square, which is slightly disappointing, but it is what it is. Okay, so tanks. For their role actions, Rampart and Low Blow are secondary, which is fine, and they do more or less the same thing they do in the game, whereas Reprisal, Provoke, Interject, and Arm's Length are instant abilities. So they're used in response to something, which is typically how you end up using them in the game anyway, so it's helpful that that's how it's set up. And now Enmity. So the way that Enmity works is Enmity is applied as a debuff to targets that tanks hit with some other attacks, which means that it also wears off after the round is over. So in order to maintain enmity on targets in combat, you have to hit them every single turn, unlike the game where you can build up enmity gauge and then just like not attack the mobs and they'll still be hitting you. Stun. Each enemy can only be stunned once, and once per encounter. And while they are stunned, you get advantage on attacks against the enemy. So this is really useful for setting up plays where like your Dragoon will stun an enemy and then use that advantage in order to get a higher chance of direct hits or crits on their attacks. All right, so Paladin. I will note, if you look in the top right of the slide, it will let you know whether this is from a fan translation, which means that it's from the Japanese Twitter account, and we've just had it translated, whether it's from the starter set or whether it's from the website. So Paladin, we only have level 30, so there's a lot of stuff that we don't know about it. But what we do know is that Fight or Flight is a secondary ability and has 2 charges. So you're going to see this a lot. Damage abilities, because so damage buffs only last for the round that you use them, but you get multiple charges depending on what the duration tends to be in the game. It's an interesting way to do it. It it's a little different. It means that there's no bookkeeping from round to round because the only thing that lasts between rounds is like damage over time and regen abilities, but uh, all of your other buffs and things tend to fall off at the end of the round. And then Paladin gets something unique in the video game that they translated to the TTRPG, and I don't think anybody was expecting this. Paladin has an ability in the TTRPG called Shield Block, which is an instant they can use once per turn that adds 1d6 to their defense against any attack that's going to hit them. This is a translation of the way that blocking works in the video game, which is only accessible to paladins or like low-level white and black mages that have shields. It's basically a chance that you reduce the damage that you take by 20%, I believe it is. It's based on the block value of the shield or something ridiculous. It's complicated. But it's interesting that they've decided to translate that into the TTRPG, given that it's such a niche thing in the game systems. And then for the limit break for Paladin, you have the damage of whatever attack is about to hit your party, and everybody in the party recovers a debuff. Then we have Warrior. So with a lot of the gauges in the TTRPG, they have condensed them. So Warrior's gauge, Wrath gauge, isn't out of 100, it's out of 4. And typically their attacks will give them 1 Wrath. So if you do your 1-2-3 combo, you end up with 2 Wrath because you're doing the 1 and 2 together as one ability, and then the 3 as a separate ability. Your Surging Tempest buff makes all of the 1s on 1d6s become 2s, which gives you a very slight damage bump. And then Inner Beast gives you 2 Wrath instead of 50, because it effectively amounts to the... Inner Beast costs 2 Wrath instead of 50, which effectively amounts to the same thing. And you get 3 charges of Berserk. And then we get to Holmgang. The invulns in the TTRPG only prevent you from dying once. If you get hit and dropped to 0, it puts you to 1 HP, but then if you get hit again before it gets around to your turn, sorry, you've been knocked out. They don't last for the whole round like you would assume they would, which is... It requires much more strategic use of it, and not simply as a, oh no, I'm just gonna negate this entire mechanic like it's used in the video game. Then Thrill of Battle and Vengeance are instants, which is an interesting choice. Vengeance, you can use it in response to an attack you know is going to be really hard hitting in order to deal a bunch of damage back. And Thrill of Battle will just heal you. The limit break on Warrior is interesting because it halves the damage that your party takes. Then the Warrior takes all of the damage the party would take after it's halved. And then whatever damage the Warrior takes, they deal back as damage. Very different from the way it works in the game. I just put Super Vengeance there as a note to myself. It's not actually the name is still the same as it is in the game, which is to say, I believe, Landwaker. Dark Knight has Flood of Darkness Edge of Darkness, Shadow Wall, and Living Dead as secondary abilities. Um, Living Dead works, uh, aside from the only preventing you from dying once, it works similar to the game, except that you have to actually hit your max HP. In the video game, you only have to regain an amount of health equal to your max HP before it runs out. In the TTRPG, you have to actually hit your max HP. And I can only assume that that is just because they don't want people having to bookkeep the amount of healing the Dark Knight is gaining. The other interesting thing is that your blood weapon is on an instant ability rather than being a secondary. So rather than a buff that gives you MP back during its duration, whenever you direct hit a target, you can expend a charge of blood weapon to gain back an MP. And then the limit break for Dark Knight, there's an attack coming in. You pick one person in the party, and the attack doesn't exist for them. It doesn't do anything to them. They take no debuffs, they take no damage, nothing. Then we move on to healers. So Repose and likewise Sleep, which we'll get into later when we get to casters, is a debuff to a target's attack roll, which makes it harder for them to direct hit, rather than actually putting them to sleep. So it's actually useful in combat because you can use it to if a target hits really hard, you can make it less likely that they'll direct hit somebody, which means you're taking less damage overall. It's effectively a mitigation. Then for your secondary, and then there's some primary abilities on all of the healers, or sorry, GCDs on the healers that have been moved to secondary abilities in the TTRPG. So things like your basic heal, like Cure and Physic, are secondary abilities, which means that they're actually useful, even if you're normally casting like Cure 2. So like, for example, I'm sure you all know the trap that some people fall into with Cure, where they try to fish for free Cure procs. In the TTRPG, you can do that and still be casting Cure 2 on your turn. So it's actually a non-issue. And then your damage over times, such as Arrow and Bio, are also on secondary abilities in the TTRPG. And Lucid Dreaming will give you an MP back at the end of the round that you use it. So effectively, it increases your regeneration from 2 to 3 for that round, but it just lasts for the one round. Again, sticking with that theme of most things ending at the end of the round. And then for instance, you have Swiftcast, Surecast, and Rescue. For Rescue in the TTRPG, they explicitly put in the description of Rescue that you have to use it on a willing target. You can't use it on an unwilling target, which is absolutely not how it works in the game. Then we have White Mage. So White Mage is interesting because their Cure 3, Medica, and Cure 2 are all very similar within the TTRPG. It's just with slight trade-offs. So Medica is like your typical just AoE healing. Cure 3 gives you more healing and has the same range in the TTRPG, but requires more MP. So you have to plan for it in advance. Whereas Medica 2 gives you less healing, but for the same MP cost and same range, but it also gives a regen to all the members of your party. So it's usable. So it's useful to use it at like the start of a fight to get the regen going, and then you can just not have to worry about it. The only other thing to note about White Mage is their Presence of Mind effectively acts as a second Swift cast, but it's only available on their turn because it's a secondary action. And then their Limit Break is the same as the Healer LB3 from the game. You revive everybody, restore all their health, but you also restore all of their MP. And now, because we're going into Scholar, pets act before you do. They get the same actions and movement as players, so they'll get a primary, secondary, instant, and movement, but most pets only have primary abilities available to them, so it's not really an issue. And jobs that have pets get the follow secondary action, which allows you to move the pet to your location. Scholar, for their Adloquium and Succor, whatever the amount that you heal is the same amount that you apply as a barrier. In the game, I believe it's like 180%. I guess it depends on your level. It's like 125% or 180% of the heal value becomes barrier, so it's not quite 1-to-1. You instantly gain your Aether Flow at the start of a phase. You don't have to use an ability to get it. And then you can spend it on Energy Drain, Lustrate, and Sacred Soil as instants. Sacred Soil will provide mitigation and regen to anybody inside the bubble for as long as it's on the ground, which is until the end of the phase, I believe. And then Fairy gets Embrace, Whispering Dawn, and Fey Illumination. So Whispering Dawn and Fey Illumination are on your Fairy now, so you can use them without needing to spend one of your abilities on your turn, which allows you to do quite a bit of burst healing in a single turn if you need to. And then Scholar's Limit Break is they do the healer LB3, but instead of regenerating all the mana like the White Mage, they give everybody a barrier when they come up. And then for melee DPS, Bloodbath is a secondary. Feint, Second Wind, and Arm's Length are instants. This means that you can feint in response to an attack that you think is going to do a lot of damage to things, rather than having to press it beforehand like you do in the game. Monk is weird because in order to actually make its whole stance mechanic work, they didn't actually condense its combos. They just made each individual hit worth less damage. Their Disciplined Fists that they get from Twin Snakes give them advantage on their attack rolls, which is interesting. And their Chakra Gauge is capped at 3. And then for their secondary actions, they have Steel Pick, Howling Fist, and Meditation, as you would kind of expect. And then Mantra and Perfect Balance are on their instant abilities. But Perfect Balance can only be used on their turn, despite being an instant. The Limit Break is a little weird because you just get to do your normal combo, but you get advantage on all of your attack rolls, which doesn't seem super impactful to me, but I don't know. Dragoon is a little odd in that they put Jump and Dragonfire Dive as primary abilities instead of secondary, despite them being OGCDs in the game. And also, they gave Elusive Jump if you roll a 1 when you do it, the GM gets to pick where you end up. Apparently, the designers like the floor tank meme. And then Limit Break is just single target damage, and then you move adjacent to your target. I am running a little short on time. I'm going to skim the rest of this. Sorry, I had some technical difficulties at the start, so yeah. But long and short of it, Bard's songs only last for 1 turn, and both of their dots are on the same ability, so you don't have to use them individually. Just makes things a little bit simpler. Interestingly, their Bloodletter, Repelling Shot, and Battle Voice are all on instant abilities rather than being secondary, which means that they're usable in response to things, which makes Bard very versatile at responding to what happens on the battlefield. And then Black Mage gets pseudo ley lines. It's very weird. Some of their abilities trigger something called consecutive invocation, which means that if they don't move, they can use a second primary ability on their turn. It's very interesting because technically Black Mage doesn't get ley lines until like level 60, but they get this level 30. Um, they also get Umbral Hearts at level 40 from Freeze, but Umbral Hearts are less useful in the TTRPG because they only reduce the mana cost of your next fire spell by 1, rather than losing the mana cost altogether. But they still have their Thunder Starter proc off of the dots that they put out from Thunder. They still have their Fire Starter proc off of their Fire. And their Limit Break does more damage if they're in Astral Fire phase, which is an interesting thing to play around. And then also, if they're in Fire, they don't regain MP at the end of the turn. But if they're in Ice, they regain 4 MP rather than 2. And finally, Summoner is a little odd. So when you Aether Charge, you get something called a Gem Mystery, and then you can use the instant ability Summon Gem right before your turn starts to pick whether you summon Ruby Carbuncle, Topaz Carbuncle, or Emerald Carbuncle. But you can only use Aether Charge if you have an unaltered Carbuncle. So you'll do unaltered Ruby, Topaz, or Emerald, unaltered Ruby, Topaz, or Emerald, unaltered, etc. And then those carbuncles modify the way that some of your abilities work, like Gem Shine and Precious Brilliance, just like it does in the game. And you can pick the same one more than once in a row. You're not limited in the same way you are in the game, where you have to do all 3 before you can go. Like, you have to do Ifrit, Titan, Garuda before you can go back to doing Ifrit again. Okay. Unfortunately, as much as I would like to do this, I was planning on having an activity where we would go over a class and sort of go into, like, have a discussion about how we could translate some of its abilities to the TTRPG. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit strapped for time, so we're going to go straight to the end and then questions. So first of all, special thanks to the FF14 TTRPG fan Discord. It's just a bunch of people who have gathered around this game and are making homebrew and all sorts of stuff. I hang out in there a lot, and they've been helpful with putting this presentation together. Thanks to @Gahustan on Twitter for the fan translations of the Japanese character sheets. And then also special thanks to AOSFU/Division10 for inspiring me to make a panel. If you want to see her panel, it is literally right after mine, so stick around for that. Alrighty, and does anyone have questions? We have about 5 minutes. Oh, right, yes. I didn't mention this, but yes, Scathe is a secondary action, so it is actually useful in the TTRPG. Anything on Red Mage? No. So the book that is coming out in February only contains the jobs from A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, so we don't know anything about the Stormblood and Onwards jobs just yet. Think of a few ways to... Yeah, unfortunately. Hoping to see Samurai. Info for out-of-combat role-playing. So I mentioned this earlier. The only real info for out-of-combat role-playing is that when you make a check, so let's say you're trying to like push a boulder, you would roll 1d20, you would add your strength, and that's all it is. It's pretty bare bones, honestly, and I'm hoping that the full rulebook, when it comes out, will kind of flesh that out a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I will note, though, that if you do check out the Discord that I mentioned earlier and should be linked later, what is it? There's a bunch of people in there that have already made homebrew for like Stormblood jobs and things. So if you wanted to play Samurai, there's like 3 different versions of Samurai out there. What's the most busted class? Okay, so I've actually gone in and done uh, damage calculations over like 5 rounds to try and balance my homebrew stuff with the stuff that already exists. And so far, the most busted class is Monk by a long shot. Monk does more damage than all of the other classes, uh, and it's not even close. But also, Monk is a fan translation, so it's probably going to get changed before release. Black Mage and White Mage. Unfortunately, Charlotte, I don't believe the TTRPG has any specific lore specific to itself, and I think it runs things. Uh, I think it runs completely off of the game's lore because it directs you to the Eorzea, uh, the Encyclopedia Eorzea 1, 2, and 3 for more information about places and lore. Okay, I'm gonna check Twitch chat really quick. Hello, hello. Level sync feels weird. Do you have any thoughts about how GMs should use it in campaigns? Personally, I prefer to actually have level uh, increases over time. So I'd probably do something similar to milestone leveling from D&D, where after a certain amount of adventures, you move on to the next tier of levels. But it's really up to you. How do you think Picto would be designed if it were added in the TTRPG? That's a good question. Um, Subtractive, like the palette. I haven't played a whole lot of Picto, but the palette gauge that you build up would probably be limited to 3 rather than 5 because the TTRPG likes to make the numbers smaller and phases don't last typically more than like 3 rounds. Um, but I can't speak too much on that one because I haven't really played much of Picto. That's the one class I really haven't touched at the moment. Combat grids are fairly small. Changes make to certain any changes you make to a certain class to make it that same kind of busted. Just increase the damage. That would be it, Kojin. Is if you would want to make something the same level of busted as Monk, you just increase the damage. Graha. Notice the combat grids are fairly small. How important is positioning tools? So, positioning tools aren't crazy important unless there is a mechanic or uh, objective on the map that requires it. I will note that enemies do put down AoEs on the ground that you then get to that you can then stand in and have to like move out of. So just like the game. So forced movement can, depending. Anyway, that is time. So I will have to call it. Yeah. If you would like to continue discussing this with me, we can do so outside, but I'm going to have to hop off now so that the next panel can begin.